They said she was nothing but a traitor's daughter who deserved to die. The executioner raised his axe high above the princess's neck as thousands cheered for her blood. But in that moment of absolute despair, when all hope seemed lost, a poor peasant boy stepped forward from the crowd. What he did next would shake the very foundations of the kingdom, and 3 days later, she would return with an army that would change everything forever. This is the story of how one act of courage sparked a revolution that kings would fear for generations.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the castle courtyard as Princess Ilara knelt on the wooden platform, her golden hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Her once beautiful gown was torn and stained, but her eyes, those fierce emerald eyes. Lord Commander Voss stood beside the executioner, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. He had waited years for this moment, years to destroy the royal bloodline that had once cast him out in disgrace. "Princess Ilara," Voss announced, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "You have been found guilty of treason against the realm. Your father's rebellion cost thousands of lives. Today, you pay the price." But Ilara did not bow her head. She raised her chin and spoke with a voice that cut through the jeering crowd like a blade. "My father fought for the people you starve and oppress. History will remember him as a hero, not a traitor." The crowd's anger grew louder. Some threw stones, others spat. But in the back, barely visible among the sea of faces, stood a young man who had not joined the chorus of hatred. His name was Thomas, and he was nothing more than a blacksmith's apprentice. His clothes were patched and worn, his hands stained with soot and calluses. He should have been cheering with the rest. After all, what was a princess to him? But something about her words struck him. Something about the way she faced death without fear made his heart pound in his chest.
Thomas had heard the stories, how Princess Ilara had secretly given food to starving families, how she had hidden refugees in the castle when Lord Voss ordered them driven from their homes, how she had begged her father to spare innocent lives during the rebellion. These were not the actions of a traitor. The executioner raised his massive axe. The blade gleamed in the morning light like liquid silver. One swing, and it would all be over. "Any last words?" Voss asked mockingly. Ilara looked out at the crowd one final time. Her eyes seemed to search for something or someone among the faces. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard it. "I die, knowing that one day justice will return to this land. Evil cannot rule forever." The executioner positioned himself. The crowd held its breath. But as the axe began its deadly arc, something impossible happened. "Stop!" The voice rang out clear and strong across the courtyard. Every head turned to see a young man pushing through the crowd, his blacksmith's hammer clutched in his dirt-stained hand. Thomas didn't know what had possessed him. He only knew he couldn't stand by and watch innocents die while evil celebrated. "I challenge the execution," Thomas shouted, though his voice shook. "By ancient law, I demand trial by combat." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Lord Commander Voss's face darkened with fury.
You dare? Voss snarled. A peasant boy challenges the judgment of the crown? The old laws still stand, Thomas said, stepping onto the platform. His legs felt like water, but his voice grew stronger. Any citizen may challenge a death sentence through combat. If I win, she goes free. Voss laughed, a sound like grinding metal. And if you lose, boy, you die beside her. Thomas swallowed hard. He had never fought a real battle in his life. His only experience with weapons came from helping his master forge swords for real warriors. But he looked at Princess Ilara, saw the mixture of hope and terror in her emerald eyes, and knew he had made his choice. I accept those terms, Thomas said. The princess stared at him in wonder. Why? She whispered. You don't even know me. Thomas met her gaze and spoke words that would echo in his memory forever. Because sometimes, my lady, doing what's right is worth dying for.
Voss's smile grew wider and more terrible.
Very well, but you won't face some common soldier, peasant boy. You'll face me.
The crowd gasped. Lord Commander Voss was legendary, a veteran of 100 battles, scarred and ruthless. His sword had tasted the blood of kings and rebels alike. What chance did a blacksmith's apprentice have against such a monster? But Thomas had already sealed his fate. The platform was cleared, weapons were brought, a simple sword and shield for Thomas, while Voss drew his infamous black blade, a weapon said to have been forged in the fires of hell itself. "Begin!" the herald announced. Voss moved like lightning despite his size. His sword whistled through the air where Thomas's head had been a heartbeat before. The boy stumbled backward, barely raising his shield in time to catch the next blow. The force of it drove him to his knees. "Is this your champion?" Voss taunted, circling like a predator. "This frightened child?" But Thomas wasn't listening to the mockery. In his mind, he heard something else. The ring of hammer on anvil. The rhythm he had known since childhood. Every sword he had helped forge, every piece of armor he had shaped had taught him something about balance, about timing, about finding the weakness in metal. And men, Thomas realized, had weaknesses too.
Voss raised his sword for a killing blow, confident in his victory. But Thomas had been watching, learning, waiting for this moment. The blacksmith's apprentice rolled to the side just as the black blade smashed into the wooden platform, sending splinters flying. For just a second, Voss was off balance, his weapon stuck in the wood. Thomas struck. His simple iron blade found the gap in Voss's armor, sliding between the plates to pierce the flesh beneath. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough. Voss roared in pain and fury, stumbling backward. The crowd was silent now. No one had expected this. But Voss was far from finished. Wounded and enraged, he fought with desperate savagery. His blade carved deadly patterns in the air, driving Thomas back step by step. "You think you can defeat me?" Voss snarled between strikes. "I have killed princes and paupers alike." "Maybe," Thomas gasped, barely deflecting another crushing blow, "but you've never fought for love." The words surprised him as much as anyone else. Love? He had known the princess for mere minutes. But looking at her there, bound and helpless, he realized it was true. Not romantic love, not yet, but something deeper. Love for justice. Love for what was right in a world gone mad. That love gave him strength. Thomas began to fight with a fury that matched Voss's own. His simple sword seemed to dance in his hands, guided by some power he didn't understand. Every blow Voss threw, Thomas met with steel. Every advance, he countered. The battle raged across the platform as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Here was a peasant boy, barely 18 years old, holding his own against the most feared warrior in the kingdom. But even love has limits, and Thomas could feel his strength failing. His arms ached, his breath came in ragged gasps. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and it would be over.
That mistake came when his foot caught on a loose board. Thomas stumbled, his guard dropping for just an instant. Voss's blade flashed forward, aimed straight for the boy's heart. But sometimes the gods smile on the righteous. The black sword, damaged from years of battle and the earlier impact with the wooden platform, snapped in half just as it touched Thomas's chest. The broken blade spun away, leaving Voss weaponless and shocked. Thomas didn't hesitate. His own blade pressed against Voss's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "Yield," Thomas commanded, though his voice shook with exhaustion. The crowd erupted, cheers mixed with angry shouts as people struggled to understand what they had witnessed. A peasant boy had defeated the most powerful warrior in the kingdom. But Voss was not finished. Even in defeat, his eyes burned with malice. "You may have won this day, boy," he hissed, "but you have signed both your death warrants. I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Thomas ignored the threat and turned to cut Princess Ilara's bonds. As the ropes fell away, she rubbed her wrists and looked at him with something approaching awe. "You saved my life," she said simply. "We're not safe yet. Already I could see Voss's soldiers moving through the crowd, hands on their weapons. The trial by combat was over, but these men answered to their commander first, the law second." "Can you run?" Thomas asked. Ilara smiled grimly. "I've been running from these bastards for months. Lead the way."
What followed was a chase that would be remembered in songs for generations. Thomas and Ilara fled through the winding streets of the capital city, with Voss's soldiers thundering behind them on horseback. "This way!" Thomas shouted, pulling Ilara down a narrow alley he had known since childhood. The passage was too narrow for horses, buying them precious seconds. But Ilara was weak from her imprisonment, and Thomas could hear her breathing growing labored. They needed somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. The old temple, Thomas decided. It's been abandoned for years. They ran through streets Thomas knew like the lines on his palm, past the baker's shop where he had once stolen bread as a hungry child, past the well where he had first learned to work iron, past all the landmarks of his simple, ordinary life, a life that had ended the moment he chose to stand up for justice. The temple loomed before them, its ancient stones dark with age and neglect. Thomas kicked open the rotted door, and they stumbled inside. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking Ilara for wounds by the pale light filtering through broken stained glass windows. "Nothing that won't heal," she replied, but Thomas could see the exhaustion in her eyes. More than physical tiredness, the deep weariness that comes from watching everything you love destroyed. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why risk your life?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of searching soldiers. How could he explain it? The feeling that had overwhelmed him when he saw her facing death with such courage. The certainty that letting her die would poison his soul forever.
"Because," he said finally, "in all my life, I've never seen anyone stand up to evil the way you did. If someone like you can't survive in this world, then what hope do any of us have? Ilara stared at him in the dim light. Here was a peasant boy who should have been broken by years of poverty and oppression. Instead, he possessed something rarer than gold or royal blood, a nobility of spirit that couldn't be earned or inherited, only chosen. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Thomas. Thomas Miller." "Well, Thomas Miller," she said with the first real smile he had seen from her, "you may be the bravest fool I've ever met." Before he could reply, they heard the sound they had been dreading, heavy boots on stone, getting closer. "They found us," Thomas whispered. Ilara stood, and suddenly she was every inch the princess again, royal bearing evident despite her torn clothes and dirty face. "There's a way out through the bell tower. I used to play here as a child, before everything went wrong." They climbed the narrow stone steps in darkness, feeling their way by touch. Behind them, they could hear soldiers kicking open doors, searching room by room. The bell tower opened onto a small balcony high above the city. In the distance, Thomas could see the castle where he had worked, the life he was leaving behind forever. There, Ilara pointed to a cluster of buildings near the city wall. The old silk merchant's house. It's been empty for years, but there were tunnels beneath it that lead outside the city. Thomas looked at the gap between buildings. It was possible to jump, but barely, and if they missed... "Can you make it?" he asked. Ilara's smile was grim but determined. "I didn't survive 3 months running from Voss's army to fall off a roof now." They heard shouts from the temple below. Time was up. "Together?" Thomas asked, offering his hand. "Together," Ilara agreed. They leapt into the night.
The tunnels beneath the old merchant's house were dank and narrow, clearly unused for years. Thomas and Ilara crawled through the darkness, guided only by the faint current of air that promised freedom ahead. When they finally emerged, they were outside the city walls, hidden in a copse of trees beside the main road. Dawn was breaking over the kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "We did it," Thomas breathed, hardly believing they had escaped. But Ilara's expression was troubled. She stared back at the city walls, her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Voss will never stop hunting us, and as long as he controls the capital, innocent people will suffer." Thomas studied her face in the growing light. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Ilara said slowly, "that maybe it's time to stop running." She turned to face him fully, and Thomas saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. Not fear, but determination. The kind of deadly resolve that once made her father's enemies tremble. "Thomas, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said before you risked your life for me." Thomas waited. "My father's rebellion? It didn't end when he died. There are others out there. Loyal knights, displaced nobles, common folk who remember what this kingdom was like before Voss seized power. They're scattered, leaderless, but they're still fighting." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time for them to have a leader again." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about escaping. She was talking about war. "Ilara," he said carefully, "you're one person. Voss controls the army, the treasury, the entire kingdom. What could you possibly do?" Her smile was sharp as a blade.
You'd be surprised what one person can accomplish with the right allies." She reached into her torn dress and pulled out something that made Thomas's eyes widen in shock. A small golden pendant bearing the royal seal. But more than that, inscribed on the back were symbols he recognized from his master's work. Not decorative patterns, but a map. "Before my father died, he hid something that could change the balance of power in this kingdom forever. The location is coded in this pendant." Thomas stared at the golden disc. What did he hide? "Proof," Elara said simply. "Proof that Voss murdered the rightful king and usurped the throne. Proof that his entire reign is built on lies and treachery." The morning air seemed to grow thicker. Thomas realized he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the entire kingdom. "If this proof exists," he said slowly, "why haven't you used it before now?" Elara's expression darkened. "Because I couldn't read the code alone. My father designed it so that two people would need to work together to find what he hid. He wanted to make sure that whoever sought justice would have to trust someone else completely." She looked at Thomas with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I think he knew that someday someone like you would help me." Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything that had happened, the execution, the rescue, the escape, had led to this moment. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Elara's smile was fierce and beautiful and terrible all at once. "Help me raise an army."
An army? Thomas stared at her as if she had gone mad. "I'm a blacksmith's apprentice, not a general. I barely survived one fight with Voss. How am I supposed to help you raise an army?" "Because," Elara said, studying the pendant in the growing daylight, "you're not just any blacksmith's apprentice. You're the one who stood up when everyone else stayed silent. You're the one who chose justice over safety. That kind of courage is rarer than you think, Thomas, and people will follow it." She pointed to the symbols etched on the pendant's surface. "Look at these markings. They're not random. They're forged symbols, the kind your master would have taught you to recognize." Thomas leaned closer, and his heart stopped. She was right. Hidden among what looked like decorative scroll work were the ancient marks used by master smiths to identify their work. But more than that, these aren't just any forged symbols. These are from the royal armory. My master used to work there before he fell out of favor. "Exactly," Elara said. "My father chose these symbols specifically because he knew that someday someone with knowledge of the royal forges might help decode them." Thomas traced the patterns with his finger. Now that he knew what to look for, the message became clearer. "It's directions," he said, excitement growing in his voice. "These symbols, they're describing a location in the old castle foundations." "The question is," Elara said grimly, "are you willing to go back? Because that's where we need to go if we want to find my father's proof." Go back. Return to the very heart of Voss's power, where every guard would be hunting them. It was suicide.
But Thomas thought of all the people he had seen suffering under Voss's rule, the families thrown out of their homes, the merchants taxed into poverty, the children who went to bed hungry every night while Voss lived in luxury. "When do we leave?" he asked. Elara's answering smile could have lit the darkness. "First, we need allies, and I know exactly where to find them." She led him deeper into the forest, following paths that seemed invisible to Thomas, but which she navigated with confidence.
As they walked, she told him about the hidden network of resistance that had survived her father's death. "Sir Marcus was my father's most trusted knight," she explained. "When the rebellion failed, he escaped with a handful of loyal men. They've been living in the forest, launching raids against Voss's supply lines." "And you think he'll help us?" Ilara's expression grew complicated. "Marcus has been trying to convince me to flee the kingdom for months. He thinks the cause is hopeless. When he sees that I've not only stayed, but recruited a—" She paused, glancing at Thomas's simple clothes. "A civilian helper, he's going to be furious." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of horses approaching through the trees. Thomas's hand went instinctively to his sword, but Ilara placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Easy," she murmured. "I know that riding style." 3 riders emerged from the shadows between the trees. The leader was a man in his 40s, his armor dented and scarred, but still bearing the faded colors of the royal guard. His weathered face went through a series of expressions: relief, joy, and then thunderous anger as he recognized Ilara.
"Princess," Sir Marcus said as he dismounted, "what in God's name are you doing here? I send word for you to flee to the eastern kingdoms." "I had other plans," Ilara replied calmly. Marcus's eyes fell on Thomas, taking in his simple clothes and soot-stained hands. "And who is this?" "The man who saved my life," Ilara said with quiet pride. Thomas stepped forward and tried to bow properly, though he wasn't sure he got it right. "Sir Marcus, I'm honored to—" "You're honored to get the princess killed," Marcus snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Every soldier in the kingdom is hunting you both." But Ilara held up the pendant, and Marcus's angry words died in his throat. "Father left us something, Marcus. Proof of what really happened to King Edward. Proof that could bring Voss down." Marcus stared at the golden disc as if it were a poisonous snake. "My lady, even if such proof exists, how do you propose to use it? Voss controls the courts, the army, everything. Who would you show this proof to?" Ilara's smile was sharp and dangerous. "The people, all of them at once." What Ilara proposed was audacious beyond belief and just crazy enough to work. "The Harvest Festival," she explained as they sat around a small fire deep in the forest. "It's in 3 days. Every noble family in the kingdom will be there, along with thousands of common folk. If we could reveal Voss's crimes in front of everyone—" "It would be a bloodbath," Marcus said grimly. "Voss's guards would cut us down before we spoke 10 words. "Not if we do it right," Thomas said slowly. An idea was forming in his mind, dangerous, desperate, but possible. "I know the castle. I've worked in the forges for years. There are passages, old routes that servants use. If we could get into position—" He trailed off, working out the details. Ilara watched him with growing excitement. "What are you thinking?" Thomas said, "The Great Hall has a gallery above it. Musicians play there during feasts. If we could get up there with the proof—" "We'd be trapped," Marcus pointed out. "One way in, one way out." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but we'd also have every important person in the kingdom as witnesses. Voss couldn't simply butcher us all without seeming like the tyrant he is." Marcus was shaking his head. "It's too risky. We should gather our forces, build a proper army." "With what?" Ilara interrupted. "We have maybe 50 loyal men scattered across the forest. Voss has thousands. We can't win through strength of arms, Marcus, but we might win through truth." The debate raged for hours. Thomas found himself caught between the princess's fierce determination and the knight's hard-won caution. Both had valid points. Both were risking everything on hope alone. But in the end, it was one of Marcus's own men who settled the argument. "Sir," the young knight said quietly, "my village was burned last week. Voss claimed they were harboring rebels, but it was really because they couldn't pay his new taxes. 20 families lost everything." Marcus's face grew grim. Around the fire, other men nodded. Each had similar stories. Each had watched innocents suffer while they hid in the forest, unable to help. "How long do we wait? How many more villagers burn while we gather forces that may never come?"
Marcus stared into the flames for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was resigned but determined. "All right," he said. "We try it your way. But we'll need a distraction, something to draw Voss's attention away from the gallery." Thomas smiled grimly. "Leave that to me." Over the next 2 days, they planned with meticulous care. Thomas would use his knowledge of the castle's layout to infiltrate during the festival preparations. Marcus and his men would create diversions at key points, and Alara would make her way to the gallery, where she would reveal her father's proof to the assembled mobility. It was a desperate plan, with a dozen ways to fail. But as Thomas lay under the stars on their final night in the forest, he realized he felt something he had never experienced before: purpose. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. "Having second thoughts?" Alara asked, settling down beside him. "Every minute, but I'm still going through with it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Alara spoke again. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." Thomas turned to look at her. In the starlight, she was beautiful beyond words, but it was more than physical beauty. There was something luminous about her spirit, something that even imprisonment and betrayal couldn't dim. "Alara," he said softly, "if we don't survive tomorrow, we will," she said firmly. "But if we don't," Thomas continued, "I want you to know that meeting you was worth everything. Worth the risk, worth the danger, worth whatever comes next." She was quiet for so long that Thomas began to think he had said too much. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Thomas Miller," she said, "you are the finest man I have ever known. Noble birth, royal blood, none of that matters. What matters is what's in here." She pressed his hand against her heart. They kissed then, under the star-filled sky, two people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to stand together against the storm. Tomorrow, they would change the world or die trying.
The Harvest Festival was the grandest celebration of the year. And this year, Lord Commander Voss had outdone himself. The castle blazed with light, the great hall filled with the finest nobles in the land. Tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, while musicians played from the gallery above. To anyone watching, it was a scene of perfect order and prosperity. Only those who looked closely would notice the armed guards positioned at every entrance, the suspicious glances, the atmosphere of barely controlled fear that lay beneath the celebration's glittering surface. Voss himself sat at the high table, resplendent in cloth of gold, playing the part of the benevolent ruler. but his scarred face was harder than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He knew his enemies were out there somewhere. He just didn't know they were already inside. Thomas had entered the castle hours earlier, disguised as one of the many servants preparing for the feast. His knowledge of the building's hidden passages had served him well. He moved through the walls like a ghost, avoiding guards and making his way toward his target. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Thomas would cause a distraction in the main kitchens, drawing guards away from the Great Hall. Meanwhile, Ilara and Marcus would use the confusion to reach the gallery. But as Thomas crouched in the narrow passage behind the kitchen walls, listening to the sounds of preparation below, he realized their plan had one fatal flaw. There were too many guards. Voss had tripled the usual security for the festival. Even if Thomas created the biggest distraction in the castle's history, there would still be dozens of armed men in the Great Hall. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to think. There had to be another way, some other approach they hadn't considered. That's when he heard it, a conversation between two guards that made his blood run cold.
"Captured the rest of them this morning," one guard was saying. "Sir Marcus and his whole band. Lord Voss wants them brought in during the feast, make an example of them." Thomas's heart stopped. Marcus and his men had been captured, which meant Ilara. He had to find her, had to warn her before she walked into Voss's trap. But as he turned to leave the passage, he heard something that froze him in place. What about the girl? Still free, but not for long. Lord Voss has men watching every entrance to the castle. When she comes for her night, we'll have her. Ilara wasn't captured yet, but the moment she tried to reach the gallery, she would be walking into the arms of Voss's soldiers. Thomas faced the hardest choice of his life. He could try to find Ilara and warn her, which would mean abandoning the mission and condemning Marcus and his men to death. Or he could continue with the plan alone, knowing that Ilara would likely be captured or killed. Unless a desperate idea began to form in Thomas's mind. It was insane, suicidal, and probably impossible. It was also their only chance.
In the Great Hall, Lord Commander Voss rose to address his guests. The conversation died away as all eyes turned to him. "My lords and ladies," Voss began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the harvest, but the peace and prosperity I have brought to this realm." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, although Thomas could see the fear in many faces. These nobles agreed with Voss because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. "But," Voss continued, his voice growing harder, "there are still those who would disturb this peace, traitors and rebels who cannot accept the new order." At his signal, guards began dragging prisoners into the hall. Thomas's heart clenched as he saw Sir Marcus and his men, battered and chained, but still defiant. "These men," Voss announced, "have been spreading lies about my rule. They'd claim I am not the rightful lord of this realm. They dared to question my authority." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Many had heard the whispered stories about how Voss had come to power, but none had dared speak of them openly. "Tonight," Voss said, drawing his sword, "I will show you what happens to those who oppose me." He stepped toward Marcus, the blade glinting in the torchlight. The old knight raised his head proudly, ready to die as he had lived, with honor. But before Voss could strike, A voice rang out from the gallery above. "Stop!" Every head in the hall turned upward. There, standing in the musician's alcove, was Princess Ilara. But she was not alone. Beside her stood Thomas, and in his hands was something that made Lord Commander Voss go pale with shock. An ornate wooden box that bore the royal seal.
"My lords and ladies," Ilara called out, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "before you witness an execution, perhaps you should know the truth about the man who claims to rule you." "Seize them!" Voss roared, but his guards were already moving, and Thomas had prepared for this moment. The gallery was indeed a trap, as Marcus had pointed out, but it was also a stage, visible to everyone in the great hall, and Thomas had spent hours in the passages above it, preparing for exactly this moment. As guards rushed toward the narrow stairs leading to the gallery, Thomas pulled a rope he had prepared earlier. Immediately, a section of the floor gave way, sending several soldiers tumbling into the space below. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it bought precious seconds. "Lord Commander Voss," Ilara continued, her voice ringing with royal authority, "my uncle, King Edward, murdered him in his sleep. He forged documents claiming the king had named him heir, and he has ruled through fear and deception ever since." "Lies!" Voss shouted, but there was panic in his voice now. "The ravings of a desperate girl!" "Then explain this," Thomas called out, opening the wooden box. Inside, clearly visible to the entire assembly, were documents bearing the royal seal, the real royal seal, not the forgeries Voss had used. Even from a distance, the assembled nobles could see the difference. But more than that, there was something else in the box, something that made several of the older nobles gasp in recognition. King Edward's crown. Not the simple circlet Voss wore, but the ancient crown of the realm, encrusted with jewels and bearing symbols of power that went back generations. The crown that had supposedly been lost when King Edward died. "My father," Ilara announced, "saved these before his death, hid them where Voss could never find them. They proved that King Edward never named Voss as his heir. They proved that the rightful ruler of this realm still lives." The crowd erupted in chaos. Some shouted in support, others in confusion, but Thomas could see the effect Ilara's words were having. Doubt was spreading through the assembled nobles like wildfire. Voss saw it too, his face twisted with rage and desperation.
"Enough," he roared. "Even if these documents are real, what does it matter? I have the army. I have the power. Right makes might, and I am the strongest." He turned to his guards. "Kill them all, the girl, the boy, the prisoners, everyone who has heard these lies." But something extraordinary happened then. As Voss's soldiers moved to obey, several of the noble guards, men who had served the crown long before Voss seized power, stepped forward to block their path. "Hold," commanded Lord Aldrich, one of the oldest nobles present. "If these documents are genuine, then we have been deceived. The law demands they be examined properly." "The law," he snarled, "is what I say it is." And with those words, he revealed his true nature to everyone present. The mask of the benevolent ruler fell away, showing the tyrant beneath. But Voss was not finished. If he couldn't rule through legitimacy, he would rule through terror. "Guards," he shouted to the soldiers who remained loyal to him, "arrest everyone in this hall. They are all traitors now."
What followed was unlike anything in the castle's long history. The Great Hall became a battlefield as Voss soldiers clashed with guards loyal to the old crown. Noble guests scrambled for cover behind overturned tables as steel rang against steel.
In the gallery above, Thomas and Ilara found themselves trapped, but not helpless. Thomas had prepared for this possibility too. "The ropes!" he shouted to Ilara, pointing to the lines he had secured to the gallery's pillars. "We can reach the main floor!" But even as they prepared to descend into the chaos below, Thomas saw something that made his heart stop. Voss himself was climbing the stairs to the gallery, his face twisted with murderous rage. The false Lord Commander had abandoned the battle below to deal with his tormentors personally. "Go," Thomas told Ilara, pushing her toward the ropes. "Get the crown to Lord Aldrich." "I'm not leaving you," she protested. "You have to." Thomas drew his simple sword and faced the narrow stairs. "The kingdom needs you alive. I can hold him here." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but she knew he was right. She grabbed the crown and swung down into the battle below, moving like the trained warrior she was. Thomas barely had time to position himself before Voss reached the gallery. The man who had terrorized the kingdom for years now faced the blacksmith's apprentice who had dared to defy him. "You should have stayed in your forge, boy," Voss snarled, drawing his replacement sword. "Now you die for your presumption." "Better to die free than live as a slave," Thomas replied, though his voice shook.
Voss was still the superior swordsman, but he was also desperate and angry. His strikes were powerful but wild, while Thomas fought with the focused determination of someone who had everything to lose. The battle raged back and forth across the gallery. Below them, the tide of combat was turning as more and more guards abandoned Voss's cause. The sight of the true crown in Princess Ilara's hands had convinced many that they had been serving a usurper. But in the gallery, the outcome was far from certain. Voss drove Thomas back with a series of crushing blows, forcing the younger man against the railing that overlooked the great hall. One more strike, and Thomas would fall to the stones below. "Any last words, peasant?" Voss asked, raising his sword for the killing blow. Thomas looked down at the battle below and saw something that filled his heart with hope. Ilara had reached Lord Aldrich and placed the crown in his hands. Even now, the old noble was holding it high for all to see, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Peoples of the realm!" Aldrich shouted. "Behold the true crown! Lord Commander Voss is a usurper and a murderer!" The effect was immediate. Voss's remaining soldiers began laying down their weapons, unwilling to fight against the symbol of legitimate rule. Thomas smiled at his enemy. "I have just one thing to say." "What?" Voss demanded. "Justice has already won." Voss looked down at the great hall and saw his cause crumbling. His face went white with rage and disbelief. In that moment of distraction, Thomas struck. It wasn't a killing blow. Thomas wasn't a killer, even of someone like Voss. But it was enough to send the tyrant's sword spinning away across the gallery floor. Voss stumbled backward, weaponless and defeated. But even in defeat, his malice burned bright. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think killing one man will change anything? There will always be others like me. The strong will always prey upon the weak." "Maybe," Thomas admitted, his sword pointed at Voss's heart. "But not today, and not while people are willing to stand up and fight back."
Lord Aldrich's voice rang through the great hall as the last of the fighting died away. "By the ancient laws of this realm, and in the presence of the true crown, I declare that Lord Commander Voss is a traitor and usurper." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, not the forced enthusiasm they had shown Voss, but genuine joy from people who had lived under tyranny for too long. But even as Thomas felt victory within their grasp, he knew they weren't finished yet. Voss still commanded forces throughout the kingdom. This was just the beginning of a larger war. Princess Elara seemed to understand this too. As she stood before the assembled nobles, crown in hand, she spoke with the authority of someone born to rule. "My lords and ladies," she said, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "Tonight we have revealed the truth about Voss's crimes. But truth alone is not enough. We must be prepared to fight for the justice we have proclaimed." Lord Aldrich stepped forward. "Your Highness, if you are the rightful heir." "I am not," Elara said simply, and the hall fell silent in shock. Thomas stared at her from the gallery. What was she doing? "My uncle, King Edward, had a son. Prince James was thought dead, killed in the same attack that claimed his father. But he survived. He has been in hiding these past years, protected by loyal servants who spirited him away as a child." The revelation sent murmurs of amazement through the crowd. Thomas felt his own head spinning. She had never mentioned a surviving heir. "Where is this prince?" demanded one of the nobles. Elara smiled. "Closer than you might think." She looked up at the gallery, directly at Thomas. "Prince James has been living among you all this time, hidden in plain sight, learning what it truly means to serve his people."
The entire hall turned to stare at Thomas. He felt as if the world had tilted sideways. "That's impossible," he whispered, though in the sudden silence, everyone heard him. "Is it?" Elara called up to him. "Thomas Miller, apprentice to Master William the Smith. But what did Master William used to be before he fell from favor? What was his position at court?" Thomas's legs nearly gave out as the truth hit him. Master William had been the royal armorer, yes, but more than that. He had been Prince James's guardian, appointed by King Edward himself. Memories flooded back. Things Master William had taught him that seemed strange for a simple blacksmith to know. The way he had insisted on teaching Thomas not just metalwork, but reading, writing, courtly manners. The old man's bitterness about the current state of the kingdom. The way he had looked at Thomas sometimes, as if seeing someone else. The night King Edward died, Master William spirited away a 5-year-old prince and raised him as his own son. He gave the boy a new name, a new life, but he never forgot who he truly was. Thomas, James, stood frozen in the gallery. Everything he thought he knew about himself was crumbling. "But I'm nobody," he protested weakly. "I'm just a blacksmith's apprentice." "You are a man who stood up to tyranny when no one else would. A man who risked everything to save an innocent life. A man who chose justice over safety. What more could we ask for in a king?" The hall erupted in cheers, but Thomas, James, couldn't hear them over the roaring in his ears. He looked down at Voss, still crouched on the gallery floor, and saw something that chilled him. The deposed tyrant was smiling.
"Clever girl," Voss said quietly, his voice carrying only to Thomas. "But you've made one mistake." "What's that?" Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "You think this changes anything. You think revealing the truth makes you strong enough to hold power." Voss's smile grew wider and more terrible. "But I still have armies in the field.
I still have fortresses throughout the realm, and I still have allies who would rather serve a strong usurper than a weak rightful king." Thomas felt the truth of those words like a blade to the heart. Even with his identity revealed, even with the crown restored, the real war was just beginning. 3 days, Voss continued, his voice a whisper of malice. "Give me 3 days, and I'll return with an army that will wash this kingdom in blood. Your brief moment of triumph will be remembered as the prelude to its destruction." But Thomas looked down at the great hall, at the faces turned toward him with hope and determination, and felt something solidify in his chest. "Then we'll be ready for you," he said.
What Princess Ilara had set in motion went far beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. Word of Voss's defeat and the prince's return spread through the kingdom like wildfire, carried by fleeing nobles, loyal servants, and travelers on the roads. But it wasn't just news that spread. It was something more powerful: hope. Thomas stood on the castle's highest tower 3 days after the revelation, watching in amazement as the impossible happened before his eyes. They came from every corner of the kingdom, not just the expected supporters, but people he had never dared to hope would answer the call. Farmers arrived with whatever weapons they could find, their faces grim with years of oppression finally given an outlet. Merchants came with wagons full of supplies, eager to support a ruler who might restore fair trade. Even some of Voss's own soldiers arrived, disgusted by their former commander's crimes and ready to serve a legitimate king. "I can't believe this is real," Thomas murmured to Ilara as they watched the growing encampment below. "Believe it," she replied, her hand finding his. "This is what happens when people are given something worth fighting for." But even as Thomas marveled at the response, he knew Voss had not been idle. Reports arrived daily of the tyrant's movements. He was indeed gathering his own forces, calling in debts of loyalty and fear from across the realm. The confrontation would come soon. "Your Highness," Sir Marcus said, approaching with a detailed report. The old knight had fully recovered from his capture and now served as Thomas's chief advisor. "Our scouts report Voss's army is larger than we hoped, perhaps 15,000 men." Thomas felt his heart sink. "How many do we have?" "Nearly 8,000, and more arriving every day, but most of them are farmers and craftsmen, not trained soldiers." Thomas nodded grimly. He had expected as much. Courage and righteousness were powerful motivators, but they couldn't wholly compensate for lack of training and equipment.
"There is one advantage we have," Ilara said thoughtfully. "We know this land. We know these people. Voss is relying on mercenaries and foreign allies, men with no attachment to the kingdom itself." "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. Ilara's smile was sharp and determined. "I'm thinking it's time to show them what happens when you invade a land whose people are willing to fight for their freedom." Over the next 2 days, they worked frantically to prepare their defenses. Thomas found himself drawing on every lesson Master William had ever taught him, not just about metalwork, but about leadership, strategy, and the responsibility that came with power. But it was in a quiet moment, just before dawn on the day of battle, that Thomas finally understood what his foster father had been preparing him for all these years. "You knew," Thomas said to the old man, who had arrived with a contingent of loyal craftsmen. "You always knew this day would come." Master William's weathered face was grave but proud. "I hoped it would never be necessary, my boy. I prayed that Voss would be content with his stolen throne and leave the people in peace. But I knew that someday someone would have to stand up to him." "I'm terrified," Thomas admitted. "Good," Master William replied. "A king who isn't afraid of the cost of war will never be worthy of his crown. But remember this, James, you're not fighting alone. Every person in that army below chose to stand with you. They believe in you. That's more powerful than any sword." As the sun rose, they could see dust clouds on the horizon. Voss was coming.
The Battle of Crescent Field would be remembered as the bloodiest single day in the kingdom's history. But it would also be remembered as the day the people chose freedom over fear. Voss had positioned his army on the high ground, confident that his professional soldiers would make short work of Thomas's peasant rabble. His banners flew proudly in the morning wind, the false colors of his usurped rule. Thomas rode out to face his forces, wearing simple mail and carrying the sword he had forged himself in Master William's workshop. He was no shining knight in gleaming armor, but perhaps that was why the people loved him. "Soldiers of the realm," he called out, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. "Today we fight not for conquest or glory, but for something far more precious. We fight for our homes, our families, our right to live free from oppression." A roar went up from the army, not the disciplined shout of professional soldiers, but the raw cry of people who had everything to lose and everything to gain. Some of you have never held a sword before today. Some of you are afraid. I'm afraid too. But fear shared is courage found. We stand together, and together we cannot be defeated. Across the field, Voss was addressing his own forces. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he could guess their content. Promises of gold, threats of punishment, appeals to greed and ambition. But when the battle began, Thomas learned something about the power of conviction versus the power of coin. Voss's mercenaries fought well at first, their discipline and training evident. They smashed into Thomas's front lines like a hammer blow, sending farmers and craftsmen reeling backward. But the people of the kingdom did not break. Every time a gap opened in their lines, others rushed to fill it. When their weapons broke, they picked up stones. When they were wounded, they fought on. They had spent years being ground down by Voss's oppression, and now all that accumulated anger found its outlet. Thomas himself fought in the thick of the melee, his simple sword flashing as he tried to be everywhere at once. He was not the greatest warrior on the field, but his presence seemed to inspire everyone around him. Farmers fought like lions, knowing their prince stood beside them. But the tide of battle was slowly turning against them. Voss's superior numbers and equipment were beginning to tell. Thomas's forces were being pushed back, their lines stretching thin. That's when Princess Elara made her move.
She had positioned herself with a small force of mounted knights on the army's flank, waiting for exactly this moment. As Voss's troops pressed forward, confident in their advantage, Elara led a charge that smashed into their exposed side. "For the true king!" she cried, her sword cutting down enemy soldiers as her horse thundered through their ranks. The shock of the cavalry charge broke the mercenaries' momentum, but it also drew Voss's personal attention. Thomas saw the tyrant urging his own horse forward, his scarred face twisted with rage as he sought out Elara on the battlefield. Thomas tried to reach her, but the press of combat held him back.
He watched in horror as Voss closed the distance, his blade reaching for the woman Thomas had come to love more than life itself. But Ilara was ready for him. The princess had been trained in swordplay since childhood, and rage at years of suffering gave strength to her arm. She met Voss's attack with steel of her own, their blades ringing together above the heads of lesser combatants. "You destroyed my family," Ilara snarled as they fought. "You murdered my uncle and drove my father to rebellion." "I gave this kingdom strength, order, discipline. You would return us to the chaos of weak kings and merchant princes. I would return us to justice." Their duel raged across the battlefield as the larger battle swirled around them. Both were skilled, both desperate, both fighting for everything they believed in. But in the end, it was not superior swordplay that decided the outcome. As Voss raised his blade for what should have been a killing blow, his horse stumbled on the corpse of a fallen soldier. The tyrant lurched forward, off balance, and Ilara's counterattack found its mark. Voss fell from his horse, mortally wounded, but not yet dead. As Ilara stood over him, the sounds of battle began to fade. Across the field, soldiers on both sides had seen their leaders fall. "It's over," Ilara said simply. But Voss used his last breath for one final act of malice. "Look around you, girl. Look at the cost of your victory. How many died today for your precious justice? How many orphans will curse your name?" Ilara did look. The field was littered with the dead and dying, good people who had answered her call and paid the ultimate price. The sight nearly broke her heart. But Thomas appeared at her side, somehow having fought his way through the chaos to reach her. "He's wrong," Thomas said firmly. "They didn't die for justice. They died so their children could live free. That's not a burden, it's an honor."
The coronation of King James took place not in the great cathedral, as tradition demanded, but in the same courtyard where Thomas had first seen Princess Ilara facing execution. It seemed fitting somehow. The place where their story began would also mark its transformation. But the ceremony was unlike any coronation in the kingdom's history. Instead of just nobles and high officials, the courtyard was packed with common folk, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, everyone who had answered the call to arms. Thomas knelt before the ancient altar as Lord Aldrich, the senior surviving noble, placed the recovered crown upon his head. The weight of it was both literal and symbolic. Gold and jewels, yes, but also the responsibility for every life in the kingdom. "Rise, King James," Aldrich intoned, "rightful heir to the throne, chosen by birth and proven by deed." As Thomas, King James, stood and faced his people, he saw something in their faces that had been missing from the kingdom for years: hope. "My people," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the packed courtyard, "we have won a great victory. But victory in war means nothing if we fail to build a just peace." He gestured to the crowd before him, to the mixture of nobles and commoners, soldiers and civilians. "From this day forward, this kingdom belongs not to any one man or woman, but to all of us. We will rebuild not just our cities and farms, but our laws and customs. We will create a realm where justice is not a luxury for the rich, but a right for all." The cheers that greeted these words seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. "And we will remember," he continued, his voice growing solemn,
those who gave their lives for this freedom. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten, and their families will not want for anything this crown can provide. He turned to face Princess Ilara, who stood beside the altar in a gown of royal blue, her beauty made even more radiant by the pride and love shining in her eyes. "Finally," James said, taking her hand, "I ask you to witness one more restoration, not just of the crown, but of the heart that guides it." He knelt again, but this time before Ilara rather than the altar. "Princess Ilara of the royal house, daughter of heroes, my companion in the darkness and my partner in the light, will you consent to be my queen?" The proposal was not entirely traditional. A king did not usually kneel to make such requests. But then, nothing about their story had been traditional. Ilara's answer was soft, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, my king, today and always." As they kissed, the crowd erupted in celebration that could be heard for miles. Church bells rang throughout the city, and bonfires were lit on distant hilltops to carry the news to the farthest corners of the realm. King James and Queen Ilara had been crowned, but more than that, justice had been restored.
The marketplace bustled with activity as merchants hawked their wares and children played between the stalls. It was market day in the capital, and the prosperity that had returned to the kingdom was evident in every laughing face and every well-stocked shop. A young blacksmith worked at his forge near the center of the square, his hammer ringing against heated metal as he shaped horseshoes and farming tools. He was skilled for his age, and many remarked that he reminded them of the legendary Master William, who had once taught the king himself the art of metalworking. As the blacksmith worked, a small crowd gathered to watch. It was not unusual. People still marveled at the craft that had produced their beloved king. But today, the observers included two familiar figures. King James and Queen Ilara moved through their people without ceremony, as was their custom. They wore simple clothes and carried themselves with the easy grace of rulers who had earned their authority through service rather than birth alone. "Your Majesty," the blacksmith said, recognizing them despite their informal dress. He started to bow, but James waved him back to his work. "No ceremony needed," the king said with a smile. "We just came to see how the newest member of the Smiths Guild is settling in." The boy, his name was Peter, and he had been orphaned in the great battle 3 years ago, beamed with pride. "Master Thomas taught me well before you called him to be your advisor, Your Majesty. I mean to make him proud." James nodded approvingly. Master William had died the previous winter, peacefully in his sleep, and Thomas, who had chosen to keep the name that marked his humble origins, now served as the king's chief counselor on matters both great and small. "I'm sure he's very proud," she said gently, "as are we all."
As they continued through the marketplace, James reflected on how much had changed. The kingdom prospered under laws that protected common folk as well as nobles. The army was made up of citizen soldiers who served out of loyalty rather than fear. Trade flourished under regulations that prevented exploitation while rewarding honest labor. It wasn't perfect. No kingdom ever could be. There were still disputes to settle, problems to solve, difficult decisions to make. But for the first time in years, the people went to bed at night without fear of what tomorrow might bring. "Do you ever regret it?" Ilara asked quietly as they walked, "giving up the simple life for all this responsibility?" James considered the question seriously. The crown was indeed heavy,
and there were days when he longed for the uncomplicated work of the forge. But then he would see something like today. Children playing safely in the streets, merchants trading fairly, people building lives free from oppression. And he knew the answer. Never, he said firmly. This is what we fought for. This is what they died for. How could I regret giving people hope? Ilara smiled and took his arm. That's why they follow you, you know. Not because you were born to rule, but because you chose to serve. As they reached the castle gates, they could see the banners of the realm flying proudly in the afternoon wind, not the false colors of tyranny, but the ancient symbols of justice and protection. The sight never failed to fill James with a sense of wonder at how far they had all come. But perhaps the greatest symbol of their transformation was not visible from the courtyard. In the castle's tower, in the room that once had been Voss's private study, hung a simple portrait. It showed not a king in royal robes, but a young man in working clothes, standing beside a forge with hammer in hand. Below the portrait, inscribed in gold letters, were the words that had become the motto of the new reign. From service, strength. From humility, honor. It was a reminder that power came not from bloodline or conquest, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others. And it was a promise that as long as James wore the crown, he would never forget the lessons learned in a blacksmith's shop, where he had first understood the difference between building and destroying. The kingdom was safe, the people were free, and justice had been restored to the land. But more than that, hope had been reborn, and hope, once kindled in the hearts of free people, is the strongest force in any realm.
This is a tale of transformation, not just of a kingdom, but of the human spirit itself. Thomas began as a simple blacksmith's apprentice, invisible to the powerful, ignored by history. But when faced with a choice between safety and righteousness, he chose to act. In that moment, he discovered a truth that tyrants throughout history have tried to suppress, that ordinary people, when they stand together for what is right, possess a power greater than any army. Princess Ilara could have fled to safety, could have abandoned her people to save herself. Instead, she chose to fight, to risk everything for the chance that justice might prevail. Her courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act despite that fear, because some things are worth any sacrifice. Together, they proved that true nobility comes not from bloodline or title, but from character and choice. The crown that Thomas wore at the end was earned not through inheritance, but through service, not through conquest, but through compassion. And perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when evil seems triumphant and hope appears lost, one person willing to stand up and say no more can spark a revolution that changes everything. Sometimes the greatest battles are won not by the strongest sword, but by the bravest heart. In a world that often celebrates power over principle, their tale stands as proof that justice, though it may be delayed, can never be truly defeated as long as there are people willing to fight for it.